Welcome, everybody. I'm in the very privileged position of being able to welcome and introduce Chris Weedon, who fortunately needs no introduction. Chris.
Right. Well, I mean, there are quite a few young people in here who I don't know because I haven't been around very much. But anyway, but maybe maybe we'll get to know each other over the next time period. I'm going to start with a little bit of background. Most of what I'm saying will be on the screen for those of you who want to read it, but this isn't on the screen, this preamble. It's a background to this whole project. Now, in 1993, I was an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the Free University in Berlin, where I was conducting archival research on 19th century German women's writing. But while I was there, I carried out a number of in-depth life story interviews with former citizens of East Germany, mostly resident in East Berlin, but in terms of where they came from from all sorts of regions in the country and beyond. They were from different generations and different backgrounds, and their dates of birth ranged from 1904 right the way up to 1997, and that's very important for my project because in some of the interviews, I've got really interesting narratives about about Nazis and the end of the war, becoming a refugee, and this sort of thing. So they included, for example, refugees from East Prussia, returned Jewish exiles who'd been in exile during the Nazi period, and even a black American exile from McCarthyism, who had unfortunately got stuck in East Berlin. He'd gone there en route for Sweden and they built the wall. He didn't have any proper papers, so he ended up living there. And he was a cartoonist and used to do cartoons for their satirical magazine, which still exists, called Eulenspiegel. My interest goes back much further than that, from 1993, because I spent a whole year in Dresden in 1974 teaching English at the Technical University there. And as far as memory goes, I've been interested in memory since the 1980s. I was involved for over 25 years in a project in Cardiff Bay collecting life stories and photographs and other documents. The most important aim of this community-based project was to change the archive. And in part, I see my project here, or one side of it, as also contributing to the archive, because these stories, I think, actually matter. My current work on memory looks at questions of subjectivity and the constitution of cultural and collective memory as they have affected former citizens of GDR, East Germany. The broader context of this work is, of course, the social and cultural effects of German unification. Now, few other countries have looked back on and accounted for their recent history from such a short historical distance as post-unification Germany. In the case of the GDR, witnesses from many age groups are still alive, and various oral history projects have been conducted over the last 26 years. Documentaries about the GDR are still shown repeatedly on a number of TV channels. Issues continue to be discussed in the media every other year, or practically every year seems to be a sort of anniversary of something. Individuals have published books based on their own experience. This is increasingly the case, and this experience includes things like arrest and imprisonment. People have contributed to collective publications, and museums and heritage sites have curated exhibitions that address in various ways a way of life that disappeared in 1990. All of this has helped to shape common yet controversial sets of hegemonic and counter-narratives about what the GDR meant and what it was like. The aim of my research is to reflect critically on the production and reproduction of forms of public and private memory in relation to the GDR and their social and ideological roles in the changing contexts of 1993, when I did my first set of interviews, and the present. I've done another set of interviews. I aim to explore how memory narratives and counter-narratives are produced in public and private spaces and places. In addition to my interviews, these include the internet, audiovisual media, publishing, museums, non-state organisations and the heritage industry. I approach my research from a cultural studies perspective concerned with discourse, subjectivity and power, and examine the role of cultural institutions and practices in constituting social and individual memory. In the wider project, I look at how individuals, groups, commercial organisations and state institutions have produced, challenged or modified hegemonic versions of life in the GDR, and the interests at stake in these narratives and modes of representation. I ask whose histories are represented, how constructions of collective memory relate to subjectivity and identity. I focus on what motivates the ways in which national memory, in this case German national memory, is articulated. The analysis of their intellectual and affective power will, I hope, allow me to advance more generally applicable arguments about subjectivity and the cultural politics of memory in contemporary Western democracies that are now very much part of a globalized digital world. My project aims to produce historically grounded, theorized analyses of ways in which individual memory narratives, public history, museums, tourism, the media, oral history and life writing both shape and respond to forgetting and remembering. From a theoretical perspective, I'm interested in located memory and subjectivity, in questions of how people remember and why, and in questions of affect and memory. This involves detailed textual readings of individual narratives in their historical and social contexts, in relation to what memory theorists following Albach's call frames of memory. At issue here are how these relate to broader social forgetting and remembering. Recent research in the psychology of memory suggests that biological memory is not well suited to producing full and detailed accounts of the past. I'm very indebted to Alessandra Tanassini, who brought this to my attention. She's written a very good article that's going to appear quite soon on recent biological, psychological work on memory, mostly done in relation to things like witnesses of crimes, but it can be transferred across to other areas. Human memory, psychologists argue, serve to form and strengthen social bonds and lay down representations to be used to imagine future possible events and for planning purposes. This research also suggests that forgetfulness is an essential component of the mechanisms by which a shared version of a common past is developed. While various institutions and practices promote specific narratives of the past, they also promote forgetting. At issue here is both the adequacy of the archives and of public history and the undermining of the legitimacy of particular subject positions and modes of subjectivity and their accounts of the past. For many ex-GDR citizens with whom I've spoken, this is a strongly felt injustice, and it's one that's lasted through the last 26 years, that can not only lead to what Ricoeur calls unjust memory, but also has profound psychological, political and affective implications for the individuals in question. How particular narratives come into being has a history that's both individual and social and relates to broader discursive contexts. My project engages with people as subjects of history, placing their subjectivities as manifest in their utterances in a broader discursive context in which individuals live their lives and formulate their often changing memories, both what they say and the language they use. Language use needs to be located in a wider discursive field on which individuals draw at the particular time when they give their life story interviews. Underpinning this is a set of theoretical questions about how people remember, which draw on interdisciplinary memory work. In looking at the wider discursive context and considering how public history, in the form of textbooks, museums, films, internet-based resources and publications, shape the field of cultural and collective memory, the analysis of continuities and changes in forms of public history, media representations, heritage and tourism since reunification will help piece together the social frames of memory in play since 1989. So I'm going on now to the actual PowerPoint text. Cultural and collective memory and their relation to questions of power, voice and representation and identity are important cultural political issues. So are the politics of forgetting. This paper is part of a project that looks at issues of public history and memory, of truth and ethics in representations of the GDR. There are now a large number of museums and tourist venues marketing the GDR, as well as a profitable nostalgia industry. Old film footage is regularly broadcast on TV and the internet. Alongside mainstream publishers, people are publishing and self-publishing memoirs, life stories, and even fiction about life in the GDR, including texts about encounters with the Stasi, imprisonment, and shootings at the border to West Germany. All these phenomena raise issues of public history, of truth and ethics in representations of the GDR. They pose questions of how power structures the field of representation, how new digital media affect it, and why representation matters. They relate directly to how aspects of the GDR past are used in the present. In the 1990s, in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the precipitous reunification of Germany, many former GDR citizens described to me how they saw reunification as being taken over by West Germany, and how many valuable aspects of GDR social life were being sacrificed in the process. They expressed strong feelings that they had not only lost their Heimat, with its familiar form of social and affective relations and values, but that their voices had become delegitimized. As I already explained, in 1993 I conducted these in-depth interviews with 18 East Berliners of different generations, and I'm now revisiting this unpublished research in the light of 26 years of consolidation of Germany as one nation. I'm also conducting some new interviews and a study of a range of cultural practices concerned with the cultural politics of memory, with a particular focus on museums, documentary films, and forms of life writing. This paper looks at examples of the ways in which the German Democratic Republic is remembered. It's based on oral history interviews, media programs, and actual sites of memory, such as the DDR Museum in Berlin. I begin, however, by listing what are for me some of the key points about what I'm calling the cultural politics of memory, which we can take up in discussion if you want to. So for me, key issues in collective memory are the importance of memory to the present, to identities and social values, norms and practices, the uses of memory, the complex dynamic between past and present that shapes memory, individual and collective aspects of memory, the relationship between private and public memory, the role of forgetting in the shaping of memory, issues of power, for example, whose stories are remembered and in what ways, the relationship of cultural and collective memory to history, the role of trauma, and the role of nostalgia. So I'm going to move on then to the GDR in public history and heritage. Since reunification in 1990, a number of hegemonic discourses have emerged in representations of the GDR. In the media, which continues to broadcast documentaries about the GDR, the term Deutsche Demokratische Republik has been largely replaced by SED-Diktatur, that's the dictatorship of the Socialist Unity Party. This term, together with Stasi-Staat, Stasi state, and the controversial term Ostalgie, which is a neologism that combines the German word for east and nostalgia, dominate representational practices. In all these representations, restrictive spaces, physical, socio-cultural and ideological, that are violently imposed and policed, play a central role, along with dictatorship. This is perhaps unsurprising, as Dominic Boyer argues, and I'm quoting here, mass media in Germany are almost exclusively owned and managed by West Germans. In much material about the GDR, the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, along with the ideological indoctrination and physical containment, are paramount. GDR citizens are represented as effectively locked into the Soviet bloc, with no freedom of thought or movement and subject to the constant threat of and punishment and the Stasi if they make their criticisms public. While the role of the Stasi was clearly very extensive and extremely repressive, the dominant role it assumes in public history often silences other factors that made the GDR what it was. It also serves to delegitimize the voices of those who believed in a socialist alternative to West Germany, or liked aspects of everyday life in the country. At the same time, those who were arrested, abused by the Stasi and by the prison service, also feel strongly that the dominant forms of collective memory currently in circulation do not do justice to their experience. For them, the ethics of memory are paramount. Much of this debate occurs within the dominant binary opposition between anpassen, conforming, and widerstehen, resisting. In his contribution to the collection Die Schuld der Mitläufer, The Guilt of the Fellow Travellers, a book which was edited by Roman Grafe, Wolf Biermann writes, conformity or resistance assumes a black and white perspective on a colourful world. Even the grey in the grey of the GDR dictatorship was, on closer inspection, a colourful grey. Most people in the GDR always did both at the same time, conformed and resisted. I'm not going to focus on this question of Anpassung versus Widerstehen today, although how it does or does not feature in life story interviews and written narratives is one important aspect of my research. Rather, I want to talk about the nostalgia industry and museums as examples of how specific versions of the GDR past are being used in the present. And I hope this will lead to an interesting discussion. In the built environment of post-unification Berlin, a number of key sites are marketed as visitor attractions, as for example on the Visit Berlin website, which you can look up for yourselves. These include, for instance, the DDR Museum, the Mauer Museum, that's the Wall Museum at Checkpoint Charlie, the Tränenpalast, which is a border crossing between east and west at Friedrichstrasse, the Alliierten Museum, the Museum of the Allies, a preserved section of the Berlin Wall, the Stasi Museum, a museum of everyday life, and what is marketed as Stalin-style architecture built in the 1950s. The importance of the built environment to memory is clear, and it has been a contested area since 1990, when many streets in the former GDR were renamed, or some went back to their pre-war names, and some cities were renamed. I can only think of one actually, which is of course Karl-Marx-Stadt, which went back to being Chemnitz. One of the most controversial examples of the cultural politics of remembering and forgetting is the fate of the Palast der Republik, the Palace of the Republic in Berlin, just to give you an example. So on the 12th of June 2013, Deutsche Welle is the equivalent of BBC World, reported, Germany lays new foundations for the Berlin Palace rebuild. Germany has begun reconstruction of the Berlin Palace, home of a line of Prussian and German monarchs. The ruined original was razed after World War II, and the rebuild is proving controversial. And that's where it used to be. The project, and I'm carrying on quoting from Deutsche Welle, the project has proved controversial because, as a first step, it entailed the pulling down in 2006 of the Palace of the Republic, the East German Parliament building that had been built during the communist era on the site of the former palace. That building, completed in 1976 and demolished in 2006, was regarded by some East Berliners as a symbol of their identity, while memories of the old royal palace were seen as symbolic of Prussian militarism. That's what the Palace of the Republic used to look like. It was the Parliament building and also a cultural centre. When the decision to build the Stadtschloss, that's the city palace, had finally been taken in 2009, the New York Times called the decision willed forgetfulness, unforgivable here, of all places. It described the graffiti on the side of the demolished Palace of the Republic. The GDR never existed. So, and it remains, I mean, obviously, it's a fait accompli, but it remains quite an issue for East Berliners. This is where the Stadtschloss has more or less got to. It is eventually going to house the ethnological collection that has been in Dahlem up to now. Space, place, and the materiality of sites of remembering are crucial dimensions of collective memory. Space and place have particular roles to play in producing memory narratives, be they individual, group, national or diasporic. They can produce strong affect. Ultimately, they contribute both to the reproduction of and challenges to hegemonic social relations and structures. The selective process by which the built environment has been changed over the last 26 years has included the renaming of streets, removal of some buildings, and restoration and preservation of others. Among those preserved are many sites of memory that relate to the Stasi. These have become symbolic of the GDR as a place of repression and containment. I want to move on now briefly to nostalgia. If the Stasi Staat, the Stasi state, is one hegemonic discourse of the past, which it sits uncomfortably alongside the Ostalgie, the industry, which remains the other major aspect of representations of the former GDR. Greismann, in his 2001 article on nostalgia and memory in the GDR, describes on how visiting Berlin he encountered, and those of you who've been to Berlin will no doubt recognize this, dozens of sidewalk peddlers doing a brisk business in souvenirs of the old regime, of course also of the Russians, not just the old East German regime. German citizens were buying up obsolete brands of soap, wine, foodstuffs, and apparel, most of them characterized by cheap ingredients or shoddy workmanship. Later I went to a music store where hundreds of CDs featuring the music of the old communist state were on display. Later I learned that this retail trade was just the tip of the iceberg. And this is still the case in 2017, although East Germans who are old enough to remember still challenge the description of GDR products as defined by cheap ingredients or shoddy workmanship. It's the sort of things that really alienate them. Daphne Bernhardt's contention from 1999 also remains relevant today. And here I'm quoting, "The last several years have witnessed the birth and boom of a nostalgia industry in the former East Germany that has entailed the recuperation, reproduction, marketing and merchandising of GDR products, as well as the museumification of the GDR everyday life." Whether or not the nostalgia industry has anything to do with felt nostalgia among those who experience the GDR is a crucial question and points to the importance of understanding how the term nostalgia is, I would argue, indiscriminately applied to diverse phenomena that serve a range of economic and ideological interests and functions. My interviews, conducted in 93 to 94 and then 2015 to 16, offer little evidence of nostalgia or of a wish to return to the GDR as it was before unification. This is also the case for other researchers, such as Dominic Boyer, who writes, quote, "In hundreds of interviews with former GDR citizens, I have not once heard an East German of any age fantasize the return of the GDR. It is, however, a constant, continuing sort of response that comes from West Germans to any East German who says anything positive about life in the GDR. So, in my interviews, people often regret lost aspects of GDR life that in 1989 seemed to promise a third way that was neither the GDR nor the neoliberal West German alternative. Dismissing such statements as nostalgic serves to delegitimize them. If positive memories of life in the GDR are necessarily tempered, like the actual lived experience at the time, by the very real material constraints under which people lived, including shortages of many non-basic commodities, restrictions on travel, and the role of the Stasi, oral history interviews suggest that these constraints were both experienced very differently by different people and need to be weighed against the positives of everyday life in the GDR, many of which offered a real alternative to the neoliberal Western discourse of freedom, choice, and consumption. The difference for example, just to give you the example of freedom, there's freedom to, which is very much, the sort of Western version of freedom, and there's freedom from, which was the East European version of freedom. So freedom from unemployment, freedom from ill health, freedom from, yeah. Obviously, that's a sort of binary, but that's never acknowledged in any of the representations. And I mean, representations have improved no end. And if you go around some of the exhibitions, there's a new exhibition of everyday life in East Berlin, which is actually quite good. And East Germans even like it. But if you go to something like the German Historical Museum, it's not that what they say isn't accurate. It's that there are lots of things they don't say. Yeah, it's what they leave out rather than what they put in, and it's also the way in which they never acknowledge that those things are very similar in the West. Yeah, that the West had a secret service, or that the West had this, that, and the other. It's always a pathology. So, and that's really one of the problems with all of it. If positive memories of life in the GDR are necessary... Oh, I've just done that bit, sorry. Go on. So, next one. The GDR is an interesting case study, an interesting case in the study of nostalgia, precisely because the power relations at play in the public sphere dismiss positive East German memories and, Boyer would argue, help prolong the division of Germany at a subjective level. I think there is still plenty of evidence for this among older people. I mean, obviously, this is a problem that will die out eventually, but at the moment, although it was interesting, because I gave a talk to students while I was in Berlin for 3 months last autumn, and it's interesting how a lot of the stuff is just being passed down through families. So, you know, they still have very similar attitudes and very similar critiques, even though they have absolutely no memory. Some mostly born after the end of the GDR. The Nostalgie industry is largely West German inspired and owned. For example, the Bavarian-owned magazine Super Ilu, which is targeted East Germany and is very much targeted as an East German market, or the DDR Museum in Berlin. And despite critiques of the term Nostalgie, it's now firmly part of consumer culture directed at Germans and non-Germans alike, and there are many businesses and websites that market themselves using this term. The website Top 10 Berlin includes an Nostalgie page, which lists the restaurants, shops, design and food outlets. The restaurant in particular is marked as an affective space. In Ostel, you feel quickly that you are back in the past. Everything is furnished in the old Ostchic, with yellow patterned wallpaper, standard lamps with beige lampshades and functional furniture. Nostalgia can function in various ways, for example as a site of pleasure in past memories, or as a technique for coping with the present by granting access to imagined places and spaces that have become inaccessible, if they ever really existed. As an affective space, nostalgia can function as the basis for an empowering, critical counter-narrative to forms of nostalgic memory that look backwards, addressing the limitations of the present. A good example of this is the success of GDR rock music since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Objects, spaces and places can produce multiple meanings and emotions, and the example of this that I now turn to is the DDR Museum in Berlin. Must be the most hated museum by East Germans going, I should think, probably. But anyway, there it is. It is original GDR products that form the core of the DDR Museum in Berlin. It's right in the centre of East Berlin, along with an oppressive use of space, both of which are used to produce specific affective responses to the depiction of everyday life in the GDR. The nature of this affect will, of course, depend on the viewer and often have little to do with nostalgia. For example, it may promote voyeurism or a feeling of superiority at the expense of GDR citizens. Where material culture, sounds and smells produce genuinely nostalgic affect, these are most often linked to actual experiences in the past. So it's what the visitors bring with them, effectively. The provision of a museum about the GDR has been left to West Germans, was left to West German enterprise. The museum's founder, Robert Rückel from Freiburg, recalls in an interview at the time of the opening of the museum in 2006 that it had been his girlfriend's wish to see a museum about life in the GDR that had motivated his enterprise. Working with the Stuttgart architect Frank Wittmer and the GDR historian Stefan Woller, he produced a plan for the museum, obtained a bank loan of 600,000 euros, and began advertising for objects. He was offered 10,000 objects in the first 2 years. Most of them are in warehouses in Spandau on the outskirts of Berlin. Today, huge adverts for the museum are the first thing you see when you enter the arrivals hall at Schönefeld Airport. Stefan Woller, who had studied at Humboldt University in Berlin and worked for the GDR Academy of Science, curated and directs the museum. The spatial layout is explicitly designed to create an atmosphere of being walled in. And this is a quote from their own description. You enter a crypt-like space with pillars and enter it through a wall-like structure. Then you go down a few steps and find yourself right in the middle of GDR everyday life. Having visited the museum with both non-Germans and East Germans, it's clear to me that while the range of objects on display can arouse positive emotionally charged forms of recognition among former GDR citizens and others who knew the society, the selection and display of the objects, together with the text panels, are variously experienced as highly ideological and often insulting. The selection of exhibits plays into widespread media stereotypes of the GDR citizen. Various scholarly analyses of post-unification mediatized culture, mostly in the first 10 years after unification, identified these stereotypes. And here I'm quoting from an article from 1997. East Germans are said to be more authoritarian and nationalistic, old-fashioned in social attitudes, less confident, less used to taking care of themselves, and generally unable to adapt to the new Western pluralist state. Differences such as these between East and West have come to be seen as self-evident and unquestionable, a fact that simply needs to be accounted for. Their ongoing social construction in the present-day political, academic, and media discourses is seldom addressed. Now, this is from 1997, but this museum opened in 2006. It does precisely what she's describing. The text panels in the Data Air Museum and the guidebook both have productive links between GDR social structures and practices and authoritarian personalities. Now, the most famous one of these, I think, is they have a picture of the kindergarten, where the little children, because they had childcare, right, for pretty much everybody who wanted childcare could have it, or very soon was able to get it. So most women worked.
And a good number of people who didn't. And a good number of people who didn't want it.
Yeah, and yes, you didn't have to put your children in.
Single mothers had to have their children were taken from them and put into care so that they could work, which they had to do.
I'm sure there are cases of that, but there are also plenty of people who were single mothers who didn't have their children taken into care. I don't know.
It was a sort of weekly boarding school for kids from very young ages, but anyway.
Yeah, well then the question there that I would want to, yes, there was boarding, creches and all the rest of it. Whether they were forced to do it or not is another question. That's all right, Evan. I'm just wondering where I got to. Oh, I was going to give you the example. So there is what has become quite an iconic photograph, and I'm sure you can find it on the internet, of all these toddlers sitting on pots. Yeah, and so they at a certain time of day are put on pots in order to go to the toilet or whatever. And this then, this has become sort of iconic for the idea that of the way in which subjectivity, or the subjectivity of these infants, was shaped in a particular way and was forced into in a particular way. It's even been linked by sociologists, by some very ideological West German sociologists, to the growth of the far right. It's used as the explanation for the far right in East Germany. This produces an othering effect that makes it impossible to take up a positive position towards any aspect of the former GDR. Displays lack any sense of history as contested or as a process. The state is presented in some ways quaint. There are sort of cliches that some of you may be familiar with, like FKK, so nudist bathing and things that are, and they show sort of newsreels of this sort of thing. But always repressive, static, and unchanging. And this is an important point, because this state existed for 40 years. But from the various museum displays, you wouldn't think that, in that 40 years anything ever changed. It's as if it was always the same. And what's always missing from these narratives is or hardly represented in the narratives, are the early years, particularly the 5 years before the two West and East Germany were founded as states, which is a really important period because that is the period precisely of idealism and the belief that you could do something different. That doesn't get into the narratives at all. By the early 1950s, things are beginning to go quite badly wrong. TV programs and DVDs about the GDR have largely been produced from the perspective of the collapse of the state. These often focus on the politicization of everyday life, including pervasive control by the Stasi. These themes, omnipresent in documentaries, are repeated over and over again. There's just some examples there. The effect of such representations is to exclude the GDR majority, who, as a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Isolde Neubart, said, settled down in the GDR and made a living, identified with their state and became neither advocates of evil nor dull and adapted, accepted the dictatorship of the proletariat and the restrictions to travel as a possibly, hopefully, transitory period to a better society, raised a family and benefited from the social measures in healthcare and were thankful not to be threatened by unemployment. Which isn't to say that, the sort of threat of unemployment wasn't massively played up by the East German government as a sort of, in terms of shaping the reasons for example, a lot of the social measures in East Germany, liked their jobs and the working environment and their colleagues, enjoyed the admittedly restricted domestic holiday resorts, or went abroad to get to know the other socialist countries, socialized with friends and members of the collective at work, and even at weekends and in their spare time, developed a lot of spare time activities according to their interests and not prescribed by the state. Dr. Neubert argues that documentaries about everyday life present a repertoire of signs and signifiers, GDR products, furniture, food, clothing, music, TV, people, now voided of their contextual meanings, which undergo a secondary semanticization. Effectively, both history and the types of experience that oral history interviews describe are absent. The images presented, I'm quoting here from Neubert, the images are presented become purely material to play with, according to one's affectivity, mental states, etc. One's lived history becomes a burlesque performance, especially in the nicht alles war schlecht, not everything was bad, approach to everyday life. This mode of presentation can be read as aiming to satisfy people's needs to identify. Everybody can pick out the signs which she or he might feel to be splinters of their personal history, which might be comforting, convenient, individually empowering, etc. GDR viewers are likely to find their individual history denied and their individual life achievements devalued. Their emotional reaction to these feelings of loss, of being ridiculed and misunderstood, may well, in part, account for nostalgia and the wish to revive aspects of a GDR which did not exist as they would like to remember it. So, in a sense, the argument is that it's precisely the negative representations that produce a sort of romantic or a forgetting that forgets the negatives and advocates the positives. It's not a level playing field, basically. Examples of this can be found in the documentary Not Everything Was Bad. Sequences start with in a positive way. Invariably, they start positively, mentioning achievements of which GDR citizens were proud, but they always end in a negative statement. They depict the GDR citizen as funny, naive, creative in the face of shortages. They're depicted as loving parties, music and alcohol, and enjoying the aroma of parcels sent by relatives or friends in the West. While this is clearly supposed to be an amiable depiction, it offers limited space for identification or for nostalgia. This documentary was aimed at showing the younger generation what GDR life was like. On close reading, it might more accurately be described as not everything was, rather than not everything was bad, but nearly everything was bad. So I'm going to finish with a few reflections on work to date, I want to conclude with some of the main points that have arisen in the project so far. Generation is crucial to understanding the social and individual effects of representations of the former GDR. And there are broadly three groups. Those who remember the war and its aftermath, and there's still quite a lot of those, and value the positives, they're mostly in the 80s now, mind, and value the positive sides of life in the GDR while critical of its lost promise and social and political and economic failings. This is the group who felt in 1993 most strongly alienated by the felt imposition of West German norms and values and the delegitimization of their right to voice their versions of the past. The second group are those born into the GDR, and these are the people who are now, a lot of them, producing their own written texts and memories and things. These are a diverse group, ranging from those who felt totally at home in the GDR, yet have come to terms more or less easily with the new social order, to those who were anxious to escape to West Germany at any cost. This group are most likely to have to come into direct contact with the Stasi, although actually, the percentage of people who came into direct contact with the Stasi was quite small. They often endorse the most negative representations of life in the GDR and have little time for nostalgia or the Nostalgie industry, even though they may work for it. Those too young to have any personal memory of the GDR, for whom cultural nostalgia often serves as a form of protest against current conditions of everyday life. My research suggests that forgetfulness is an essential component of the mechanisms by which a shared version of a common past is developed. Of course, one of the problems here is it's not a common past in Germany. It's very much not a common past. Considerable psychological research has been done with individuals on how people forget. One important aspect of this is the way in which the articulation of a particular memory narrative makes it much more difficult for the speaker or listener to produce alternative versions on subsequent occasions. This is what's come out of the research I was talking about on witnesses to crimes and things. So once a narrative has been spoken or listened to, somehow it makes it very difficult to tell it differently. That's what the research shows. And this is a crucial point to consider in relation to repeated narratives of life in the GDR produced by the media and by public history over more than 26 years. Establishing specific frames of memory that serve to endorse some and delegitimize other voices. I think that's the end. Yes, it is. Okay, all right.